Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, the Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and tonight I've got a bit of a fascinating subject to bring up. It's not just this study that was done by the University of Richmond, it's kind of how it applies to our life, and there's perhaps a lot of knowledge to be gained from this little experiment. Even though it has to do with lab rats, there may be some things here that we could possibly apply to our own lives. Either way, this research kind of resonated with me, and it's kind of a brief study here. It's a brief synopsis of what these researchers did at the University of Richmond with these lab rats, but it is very, very poignant, especially in the vein of Geek Therapy Radio. I think it'll mean a lot to us. It certainly meant a lot to me. So as you're listening to this in this morning or afternoon, night, that's the beauty of Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, is that you can listen to whenever you want. Thanks for joining me at any rate. So let's dive right into this study. So the University of Richmond did a study with some lab rats, and the aim of the study was to determine what impact the environment of a rat's upbringing. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The aim of the study was to determine what impact the environment of a rat's upbringing has on its stress response when learning new abilities or put in new situations or what have you. So basically, would a stimulated upbringing help the rats deal with stress better than being raised in a boring environment? So instead of testing a rat's stress by putting them in a maze, we've seen rats put in lab mazes 100 million times. That's a tried and true method. There's a reason why it's a tried and true method. But in this case, the University of Richmond researchers decided to instead teach the rats how to drive. How to drive little modified rat cars. Not cars shaped like rats, but rats and little modified electric vehicles. It's the coolest thing in the world. So in lieu of testing their, results with a maze, they're just going to decide to teach the rats how to drive. Because learning something new, especially something that you are not accustomed to, maybe the rats are used to mazes, who knows, but certainly we have not done many tests on rats teaching them how to drive cars. And so that might be a good procedure to undertake for this test. So the researchers decided, you know what? We're going to teach rats how to drive instead of how to walk through a maze. So the car's controls they consisted of a little floor made of aluminum and 3 copper wires at the front of the little car. So when the rat touched one of the 3 copper wires, it would complete a circuit with the aluminum floor and thereby actuate whatever motor. So the middle copper wire moved the car forward. The 2 outer wires controlled the steering. So left wire went right, the right wire went right. Left wire went left, right wire went right. That was a surprisingly hard sentence to say, but you can already assume that, left and right wires and middle wire, that makes sense that it's straight left and right. So I should mention here that completing a circuit with the rat's own body and skin does not result in a barbecued rat. Simple transistors in the circuit can assure that while the rat completes a circuit, the full current is diverted to the motors. Basically, the rat's skin is just like a living relay module. But let's get back on track, as it were. So anyways, 11 rats were used, 5 that lived in cages with lots of interesting things and toys and levels to climb, and then 6 that lived in standard lab cages. So 5 of the rats grew up in a very stimulating environment, while the other 6 rats lived in very plain Jane, bland, normal lab cages. The rats were placed in the car, and a treat was placed in different locations around the little enclosed arena. And the idea was that the rats would learn to navigate towards the treat by learning which wires to press to navigate there. So, okay, you start the rat in one corner of the cage and you have a little treat off adjacent over here. The rat would learn by touching the various wires, how the car kind of moved, and where to kind of negotiate it towards the goal of getting that treat. Navigate the car towards that treat. So fascinatingly enough, as it turns out, every single rat learned how to drive. In fact, in the video, which if you're not watching this on YouTube, if I even upload this on YouTube as a podcast, I'll include the link to a video in the podcast description. If this is on YouTube, I will put it in the YouTube description as well. But you can see the rats actually navigating this little arena. It is both the coolest and cutest thing in the entire world. By the way, side note, rats are like puppies. They are just as affectionate and just as destructive. You leave one rat alone in a room unattended, just outside of its cage, it will destroy that room like a Rottweiler. I promise you that. So rats are very cute, they're very intelligent, they're very cuddly, but they can be very destructive, just like a full-grown dog. So anyways, I personally like rats. I think they're kind of cute. But let's move on. Now, in terms of learning to drive, the rats that lived in the more stimulating cages learned to drive faster than the rats raised in the boring standard cages, indicating that the rats raised in more stimulating environments were less stressed and therefore could learn faster. That's what the tests indicated or suggested. So, to recap, the rats raised in a very cool, neat environment versus the rats raised in the boring environment. The rats raised in the interesting environment could learn and adapt to driving quicker than the rats who grew up in a less stimulating environment. So that said, the researchers only tested, they were trying to test the stress levels. The researchers only tested the rats' poop for stress indicators while they were learning to drive. So they weren't testing the poop the entire life of the rat. I think this was kind of unless I'm missing something here, this is, I dare say, a misstep in this calculation, in this research, to have kind of a baseline of rat poop before the tests and after the test. They kind of tested in those weeks while the rats were learning to drive to see, basically it was just to see if their environments that they were raised in raised or lowered their stress while learning. So it's kind of inconclusive, except for the fact that while the rats were learning to drive and they took the stool samples while they were learning to drive, there was no variation in either group's poops. Essentially, no matter the upbringing, the act of learning to drive was actually, as indicated, as they could observe, fun for the rats. The increase in joy of learning to drive or of being in the car decreased the stress. So it didn't matter where they were raised. The rats that were learning to drive showed the same level of joy in learning to drive. They did not show any increased or decreased stress versus one group to the other. While they were learning to drive, while they were in that car, that little tiny car, both rats were relatively stress-free. There was no variation between either group's poops, and that's the way they could test the stress. There's different hormones and different things they could sense or test for in the rats' poops to determine whether or not they had raised stress indicators or not. Both groups had the same. They were both relatively stress-free while they were learning to drive. But here is the really, really interesting part, at least to me. This is kind of where it all comes together and where we get sort of the main takeaway from all this experimentation, or from this research. When they took away the treat incentive, the rats that were raised in the more stimulating environment continued to play with the car and drive the car for the sheer joy of it. They appeared to drive around just for fun, while the rats raised in boring environments lost interest more quickly. Basically, for the rats raised in boring environments, there was no point to joyriding if there was no reward. The rats raised in more stimulating environments felt that, or it was indicated, that it was suggested that they received more, the reward was the joy. The reward was the joy ride in the car. Even if they didn't get a treat, even if they weren't navigating towards a treat, towards a reward, towards a goal, they just had fun driving the car, versus the other group that was raised in a more strict, boring environment. So what can we take away from from this, and this is kind of the point to all of this. This is why this research kind of got my geek antennas vibrating and triangulating and very interested in this. So what can we take away from this? At this point, it's really my own personal perspective. You may have your own opinions on it. You may have your own takeaways from that. But I'm not interviewing anyone right now. I'm not taking any callers right now, obviously. So this is just me and my perspective. Maybe it helped. Maybe you might agree with it. Maybe you disagree with it. Maybe you have a little twist on it. If you do, and this is on YouTube, I would love to know your takeaway from this research, kind of in the comments below. If you're listening to the podcast only, of course, you can email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, with what you took away from this from this study. And I'll include a link to the study also in either description, in the podcast description and in the YouTube description. Again, if I put this up on YouTube. So here is my own personal perspective on this. While the rat study was inconclusive in determining whether a living environment directly affects stress, it did suggest that the rats that were raised in more stimulating environment definitely learned faster and experienced more joy than the rats who were raised in boring environments. I do have to concede that humans are far more complex when it comes to our interpersonal dynamics and our biology, of course, and all that good stuff than a rat. One individual, for instance, may experience more stimulation in less complex living spaces, and I'll give it kind of an example here. For instance, one person may get more joy and less stress by living in a simple home with perfectly symmetrical, simple furniture with light-colored walls, while another person would love a lot of funky furniture and a fire pole, for instance, in lieu of stairs. I definitely lean towards column B. If I was given the choice between having a normal staircase and a fire pole, I would like a fire pole. But then again, now that I think about it, you would need the stairs to get up. So I would use the fire pole to get down at least. That's more fun to me. That'd be more stimulating to me. I would love, not that I have anything against my home now. I think my home now is very cool. But if my wife said, yeah, go for it, cut a hole out in the kitchen floor below your recording studio so that you can just jump on the pole and slide down in the kitchen, I would do that in one weekend. I would have that done. I would have that done in a few hours. Anyways, so I think for us, it's a matter of being honest with ourselves and how much we are willing to concede of our own well-being, either directly to a spouse or more commonly and most regrettably, because we simply think that indulging that which stimulates our minds and spirit might be considered silly or juvenile by friends, family, or society. So, for instance, we'll buy the simple white IKEA desk when we'd really get more enjoyment out of the old brown wooden desk in our grandma's attic from the 1950s that doesn't go with the white bookshelf we already have. Or, of course, vice versa. Your grandmother pressures you to take the ugly old desk when what you really want is to keep that uniform white decor. So it all depends who you are. And when I said conceding to your spouse or anything like that, in any sort of relationship like that, yes, you do have to make concessions for each other and you have to find a healthy living balance. And the key is to find a spouse that lets you indulge what best stimulates you in your living environment. You do not want to marry somebody who keeps your creativity and keeps your stimulation under a bushel, for instance. I am very lucky in my life to have that. My wife lets me do all sorts of fun things with our house within reason. That fire pole I mentioned earlier before, that probably is not going to happen, but I don't blame my wife for that at all. That's just a silly thing. I know that it's silly to think I could put a fire pole in my house, but you never know. It may happen. So here's kind of the main takeaway with everything we're talking about here. And it aligns with the entire mission statement of my own show here, Geek Therapy Radio. I say that we're all geeks about something, so embrace your inner geek. Sorry, I'm getting verklempt. One confirmed conclusion of the rat study was that the rats that led a more stimulated life at home were able to learn new things faster. And most importantly, and more importantly, they experienced more joy after the lessons were over. They drove their little car for the sheer joy of driving, even when there was no physical, worldly, earthly reward. The joy in itself of learning, the joy in itself of driving was the reward. That's the takeaway, I think. So perhaps that's it. Despite outside influences, maybe it's important not to be our own worst enemy by telling ourselves there is no point because there is no reward. Embracing your geek thing is the reward, to tie it up with my show here. So nobody is going, for another example, nobody is going to pay you, for the most part, nobody's going to pay you to pick up a paintbrush and complete your masterpiece or attempt your masterpiece. And how wonderful that is not something hanging over your head. That you're not under someone's thumb to create your masterpiece and have this feeling that you must appease them because they're paying you. To answer to nobody and to work towards nothing but what brings you the most joy. In that pursuit, I think that we'll find that no temporary worldly reward could replace such pure, all-encompassing joy and fulfillment. Now, I can only speak for me, of course, but I'd like to be the rat that keeps joyriding with no more incentive than the joyful act itself. So I kind of hope that resonates with anybody listening right now. Which rat do we want to be? Yes, it is necessary. We have to feed ourselves. There are some tasks and things we have to learn and adapt to so that we do get the piece of food after having completed the task or learned the task. That is definitely part of it. We need to do what we need to do to pay the bills. There are plenty of things in life that are uncomfortable for us to do that we would rather not do. A lot of us, and perhaps this is kind of a really good example of it, a lot of us go to jobs that we don't like so that we can pay basically to live, to survive. Pay for our homes, pay for our food, pay for entertainment, pay for whatever. What my aim is never to have a job I don't like and only compound that miserable life by coming home to a home that I don't like. Coming home to a living environment that's stale and boring or inconducive to my own joy. That even if I have a job that I don't like, that I can come home and embrace my inner geek. That I can come home and do what's good for me. Have a space set for reading. Not just a kitchen table that'll make do. Maybe that is your favorite place. I'm not saying. Maybe a kitchen table is your favorite place to read. But you know what? If possible, if you can help it, create a little nook for yourself to read, to nuzzle up and cozy up with a good book or whatever. If that's your geek thing, if that's what's going to bring you real joy in life and help you decompress and de-stress. Maybe you've always wanted an art studio or something like that. Find a place in your house that can have an easel that will take the scaffolding or have a canvas of various sizes or have your paint set up somewhere. Just give yourself something to look forward to if you have a job that you don't like. Now, there are some people that do have a job that is very fulfilling and that they do like to do. And that is the reward in itself. The fact that you draw a paycheck from it is just a bonus. And if you draw a really good paycheck from it, that's a really big bonus. But the important thing is to have at least anywhere in your life that you can help it. Have a place that brings you joy. Have a place that is conducive and conducive to doing something that brings you real rejuvenative joy. I've said on my show, and this was all, I hesitate to say this is what I'll be wrapping up with because every time I'll say I'll wrap it up with this, I always wind up going for another 10 or 15 minutes, but I'll just move the conversation in this direction a little bit. One of the things I say on my show a lot is to find even 5 minutes in your week to devote towards your geek thing, or to an old hobby that you fell out of, or a new hobby. A lot of us used to have hobbies as kids, maybe as adults, teenagers, but life gets in the way. We work, we have families, we have kids, we have all sorts of adult things that need to be done, of course, and I am not arguing that. I am arguing that even despite life getting in the way, find 5 minutes per week, at least 5 minutes per week, where you can break out your Lego set, or add to the painting that you started a little while ago, or finish a painting, or whatever it is that brings you joy, or used to bring you joy that fell out of. Now, the excuse that I get inevitably from that, always, from friends, family, and strangers, is that they literally don't have 5 minutes in the week to devote towards a hobby or a passion or anything that brings them personal joy. Any alone time for them that brings them personal joy. They don't have 5 minutes. They work 16 hours a day, 17 hours a day, 18 hours a day. They have mouths to feed when they get home. They can't find any of it. But here's the thing. If that's truly the case, then I'm sorry, and I hope that's only a temporary rut in your life. Now, I'm not saying raising kids is a rut. It's not. It can be a very joyful thing. It should be a joyful experience to raise children. But all I ask is that you ask yourself, those people who tell me they don't have 5 minutes, they have always told me that. I have always gotten that input. Most of the time, I get that input on social media. Somebody on Facebook is telling me that they don't have 5 minutes in their life to devote towards an old hobby or an old passion of theirs. Do you see where I'm getting at here? How much time, if this is on YouTube, how much time have we spent going down YouTube rabbit trails that we know we have an old bike that needs fixing? We used to love riding our bikes. If you spend an hour going down a YouTube rabbit trail, how far along to fixing your bike could you have gotten in that hour? And to the point with the Facebook stuff, people telling me on social media they don't have 5 minutes. How long do you spend on social media? The sheer fact that you told me you don't have time, but you told me on Facebook, means that we have to balance in our life. How important is social media to us? Has social media gotten in the way of our old hobbies and passions? Has social media gotten in the way of procuring a stimulating living environment? Gotten in the way of real joy? And there are endorphin rushes that we get from social media. Every time I freaking turn on Twitter, I ask myself, why the heck did I even open up Twitter? It is nothing but political cesspool of nonsense. Twitter is a horrible place. But I understand why people get on Twitter and they go on their rants and do everything they're going to do on Twitter and social media. We have assumed this sort of false equivalency that endorphin rush equals joy. That being really mean and nasty and scathing and putting other people down who disagree with your politics on social media gives us a sense of moral high ground and that joy, that endorphin rush. Because anger is an endorphin rush. Hatred is an endorphin rush. It's similar but not the same. There's a difference between an endorphin rush and joy. You can get an endorphin rush from riding your bike down the street. You get on your mountain bike for the first time in ages and you go off on some trail. You experience that endorphin rush, that real joy. Tell me how it's different. Make a note of how that is different than that endorphin rush you got from telling off a liberal or a conservative on social media. What's more beneficial? What's more beneficial to joy on the whole? Telling somebody off or getting yourself off? I don't mean necessarily in a sexual way, because Lord knows should I even go down this road? There's a difference between, I'll just say this, there's a difference between a happy marriage and sitting alone at 4 a.m. on the internet, mistaking that for real joy and real intimacy. That's the difference between riding your mountain bike, for instance, and telling somebody off on social media. Back to the point. We need to ask ourselves how much time we're wasting on social media, because it doesn't seem like that. It's kind of like the frog boiling in the pot. That analogy means that the frog gets in the pot because the water is nice and comfortable. Oh, this is really nice. This is a really enjoyable thing. That's kind of what social media is. You start your Facebook account, you start keeping up with your friends and family. Oh, this is a really nice thing. Oh. But there's an invisible hand that's slowly turning up the temperature on that water so gradually that you can't tell that you're boiling to death. And I think that's a rut that we get in with a lot of things. In this example, social media, that it starts taking up so much time away from our hobby. Yeah, I fell out of the hobby because I had kids and a job and all sorts of stuff like that. Yeah. Really? Or was it because you didn't realize that you're spending an hour scrubbing through Twitter or Facebook or whatever on your phone when you used to devote that time to a hobby? And I'm not chastising anybody. I'm not telling anybody, hey, you need to get off Facebook. You need to get off Twitter. I'm not saying that at all. There's a balance. There is a balance there. So we just have to look outside the pot. We're the frog boiling in the pot. Hey, someone's cranked that knob way. I didn't realize even how hot it was getting in here. Maybe it's time to get out, or tell the person, hey, stop turning up the temperature. You're killing me. Usually the person turning up the temperature is yourself. Usually we're being our own worst enemy, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast here. Usually we're being our own worst enemy with that. At the very worst, the saddest and most tragic thing is we don't want to indulge in our geek thing because we think that society or family or whoever will frown upon it. And I'm not talking about really deviant things. I'm talking about you don't want to make music because you're afraid if someone hears it. Or you don't want to set up your home in a funky way because you're afraid your neighbors might come in and say, oh, they might chatter about you outside on that. I hated that painting they had up. That couch just didn't work. Who cares? That's the fear we put on ourselves. What will somebody say if they see me express myself in some sort of way? What if I fail at something? What if I get into building remote control airplanes and I fail? I don't even know electronics. How can I even get into it? We're our own worst enemy. That fear of failure is so strong that we don't even start. And basically, that's the only way you ensure that you fail at it, is never starting. Bottom line is, even if you start getting into a hobby like that, let's say electronics, you're going to fail over and over and over and over and over again, but you're going to learn and learn and learn and learn and learn and be better for it. You're not going to learn anything on Facebook. Not, pardon the French, not a damn thing. You will get this false sense of losing faith in humanity. You will discover a false sense that you think you hate everybody. And even worse, you think you're going to hate yourself by judging yourself by others' fake standards. Maybe sometimes we need to turn off Facebook, pump up the tires on that old mountain bike, and feel the wind in our hair. Just like the rats felt the wind in their fur in this research, even when the incentive was taken away. They just experienced the joy of driving around in their little car. Let's be like that rat, I think. Anyways, thanks for listening. Be good to yourselves and others. If you've enjoyed this podcast, share it with your friends and family if you think they'll enjoy it. Always, you can send me an email, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. I really want to know your geek thing, what you're into, because I can share it with others and you can share it with others, and it might inspire somebody else to indulge in that thing. Maybe people had no idea they like to work with clay or modeling clay or whatever your geek thing, whatever your hobby is. It might help somebody out of an actual depression. You might help somebody out of the deepest, darkest pit of their life by sharing your geek thing with me and me sharing it with the world. That's what Geek Therapy Radio is all about. I just find everything so fascinating. So, be good to yourselves and others. Know that you are worthy of love. You are worthy of receiving love, You are worthy of giving love. You are worthy of loving yourself and your own self-respect. That's easier said than done, but let's chip away at it one brick at a time in our daily life. If it means turning off Facebook and it means getting back on that mountain bike, to start chipping away at your self-worth, to realizing your self-worth, the barrier in between you and knowing your self-worth, let's get back to that. Let's work on that. And I think we'll all be better off. Anyways, thanks for listening to Geek Therapy Radio, and I'll see you next time.
Geek Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.